Before talking to you, I should try to tell you how I think about what I'm going to try to say today. You have all probably had the experience that when you're in a conversation with Pete and you're in resonance, you say, I can see so clearly what's the most important thing to say. And then he sends you off and says, okay, put something together and deliver it in an orderly way. And you go back into the world of your own isolation and you say, now what do I do? You know, the whole world is open to us. Where do we start? So it puts you in the position of Buridan's famous ass, who's hungry and thirsty and equidistant between the water and the hay, and dies of both hunger and thirst because he can't decide which way to go. So my remarks today are basically an arbitrary commitment to something, right? Think about the phonemes in languages. No language has all the phonemes in the world's languages, because in order to be a language, you have to leave enough space between the things you include by excluding everything else that it's possible to make distinctions. So in trying to reorient and get my head out of the fog and back into YHouse, talking to Pete yesterday, I was thinking, okay, we have these modules, nature, culture, technology, reflection, and action. What happened to awareness? And Pete says awareness is the wrapper that goes around all of it. So, and this can be sort of awareness sensu stretto as just cognition in an almost computational sense, all the way up to the big problems of what the nature of self is or of consciousness. And so it's in that large sense that we want to cast this. Why should that question have a nature module? And I apologize, I'm going to do something I hate to do, which is kind of read to you. The problem is it's very hard to choose words that say what you mean, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to try to wing it today, because I don't want to leave things out or forget them. So a lot of people have recognized in trying to think about what life is or what cognition is, that the seeds and primitives of what become cognition were brought into existence already in the earliest stages of life. So the notions of making distinctions, of computing. And so for people who try to identify things through their properties, this has created a conundrum. In our common language, we have different words that are sort of centered on different domains of concepts, and yet as we try to look at them precisely, the reasons for those distinctions start to get lost in all of the particulars that they have in common. So what we were trying to do in conversations between us over the last year is to say, okay, what can we distill out of the successful sciences of the natural world that have something to contribute to structuring this conversation? So one of the things that, for the sake of today, I'm willing to put forward is the idea that in the sciences of matter, so the origin of space and time, the vacuum, the matter in the vacuum, and then all of the states of matter, there's a kind of a foundation of innovation which was not obvious and which we had no formal way to think about until it came to us from behind in describing particular things. That's something that physics, chemistry, and biology should be contributing to a more integrative science. Now, beyond the successful parts of understanding matter, we have new problems like the origin of life, and this is where we get into the idea that the seeds of cognition are already there in life. Why do we have two words? Where do we want to put the differences? So on the third point here, people will often take dogmatic positions for reasons that I don't understand. There will be those who will say we should find whatever constitutes the essence of some common language word. What is life? What is cognition? What is consciousness? And then there are other people who will say no, to be empirical you have to be a property person, and because the attempts at essences always get blunted as the properties are shared, that shows that the effort to find essences was misguided. I don't see it that way. I think we're in the early phenomenological stages of a science where I'm using phenomenology not as philosophers do, but as physicists do, where we have rough and approximating languages that capture pieces of problems, but we don't yet have a consistent reasoning system that shows what role each of them plays. So one of the conversations I hope we will have sometime this morning is, from what we think about life and cognition and awareness, what can we say that should get us in the ballpark of where the centers of these ideas are, at the same time as recognizing that their components are often shared. Stepping back, though, to the natural sciences, which will be the source of most of what I say because about them I can speak precisely. I think we can talk about the primitives of the introduction of order into the universe or into our understanding of the universe that had some non-obvious roots, some of which took us centuries to discover in the natural sciences. They were learned outside the domain of cognitive studies, but as we try to understand the emergence of the elements of cognition or individuality or whatever, we often seem to find the same primitives recapitulated in a different substrate. So it's worth trying to articulate what we know about some of those to see which of them may have some use. So let me start with the issue of novelty as we understand it in the other natural sciences, and then look at how that reflects on the character of the emergence of novelty in our state of knowledge about the world, or in what we build as social cognitive practice, and what developmental trajectories that creates for us as forming humans, because there are new things that come into being in both of those domains as well. For the sake of this conversation, let's suppose we focus on the idea that the theory of matter, as it's currently understood, is a kind of story or narrative of how modes of order that were latent or potential in what we call the laws of nature, but had never been instantiated, came to be real instantiated properties of the material universe. Non-trivial how that came about. As we look at the transitions through which new kinds of order come into existence in life, in learning, where that can be human cognition, but it can also be computational learning, in the emergence of algorithms and the structure of process, or in the things that we put in informal language behind the concept of mind. Often, if you're a physicist, I don't think this is just seeing everything as a nail because you had a hammer. I think there are questions that go unasked where in physics you look at them and you say, I think there are non-trivial conditions of possibility for that to have happened that the people in the domain are not yet asking, and we can try to introduce those questions. Just like we used the terms particle for a long time without having a meaning for them, and it was only after solving questions that looked unrelated that we first built a concept of particle and then reattached the name to it anew. So I know that the condition of possibility is a technical term that the existentialist philosophers use. I don't make any pretense of having a command of all the discourse that they build around it, but I think just as Kant was trying to understand the role of space and time in a generation when the physics available to him could not possibly have allowed him to do that, the meaning is essentially the same as his, that the set of things that come into existence are rare compared to those you might imagine are possible, and it's a technical matter when they are enabled and when they're not. So, question that maybe the nature module of YHouse can allow us to pursue is, what parallel dynamics do we see when we study a new kind of order that is brought into existence in the material universe? The first stage in which we go from not having a perception or an understanding of that order to having something we would call. So having something in us or in our discourse that is in some way faithful to the nature of order in the thing that we're trying to understand or to describe. And then in this idea that Pete likes to call the innovation circle, how we begin to build social cognitive practice to overcome the limits and the illusions that are inescapable within a human mind or within a human's perception, but then which become measuring devices or thinking devices to allow us to see beyond what we would see with our own native abilities. So stepping now beyond sort of laws of nature in general to things that come up particularly when you try to understand how you go from a world without life to a world where the biosphere is part of that system. I would argue that a lot of the properties that set life apart from the categories that were existence in a universe before life was part of it concern changes in the way local variables carry information. And particularly what I mean is that if all you have is the vacuum and matter, in some sense, everything is the here and now. And the connection of one here and now to another here and now takes place through all the things that are in between. When you start to have the emergence of individuality, of cognition, of other things like that, as a stochastic process person would say, the state of the universe carries everything from its history that's relevant to the possibilities for its future, but the architecture of that state can change a lot from one kind of condition to another. And the architecture that's characteristic of that state in the pre-living world does not contain in it the kinds of architectures that exist in a living world. So in the living world, there is a lot in me that is about what's not here, that's what is not now, and also what is not me. So can we break down the process for how the physical world needs to form new architectures for that to be possible? Some stages that I think we can identify, for lack of a better word, facultative memory, a little bit of the universe that's not permanently bound to its immediate surroundings, but not permanently isolated from them, but that can come into and out of contact, and so can remember things. When it has processes, the emergence of autonomy, that internal degrees of freedom can start to have their own dynamic, not always embedded in cause from their immediate surrounding. And a lot of this is bound up with the role of individuality and the emergence of an evolutionary dynamic in the living world. When you have autonomy and when you have memory, it becomes possible to form representations, so things that reflect or that mimic the not here, the not now, and the not me. And those are sort of entailed in the concept of the emergence of control and feedbacks. And then as you start to become reflective, not only responding to a world with things remembered, but being capable of imagining your own self as a consequence of what you do, you can bring in the concept of agency. Each of these things exist as an abstraction in some body of practice, but there's a lot in ordinary natural science that has not been done to understand when a world that does not require these abstractions to be described changes its architecture so that these become good abstractions and necessary abstractions to describe what's in that world. So let me try a kind of a gambit that came up in conversation with Pete yesterday. Of course, YHouse is never about any one thing. YHouse is about whatever you're talking about with who you're talking about that day. But yesterday at one time with Pete, he says, actually YHouse is all about understanding novelty. So its origin, its nature, its roles, its consequences. Suppose we were to take that as a premise and see what followed from it. I think you could argue, and this comes from an observation that Eiko-san made a few weeks ago when we were talking about how things that social theorists can see and are looking for formal languages to describe overlap with things that Evo-Devo people have also been looking for good ways to describe. In a world of static architectures, we do a good job of making a quantitative science because we can guess what the statistical observables should be, and the things that are easy for us to guess tend to be static and stable, so you can get good statistics on them. If we want to start understanding a world where there's change, but the change has structure, we do much less well at guessing what the stable observables should be. And in the absence of a way of reasoning about or systematically working our way toward what those observables should be, we try the naive observables, but they're not stable. So, I take this computer apart, I look at some transistor somewhere in the middle of a chip, and I say, is it 0 or 1, and what do I learn from that? That's a very, very poor way of understanding what the computer is doing, even though the computer at some level is very simple in its architecture and its purpose. So how do we do better? The trope for this discussion would be to say that the thing that sets cognition apart is that cognition forms to provide a system for responding to events that may have nothing else to do with each other and only form a category in the fact that they're not recurrences of anything. So cognition as opposed to the architectures of static things. So how does then not only the nature module offer to YHouse, but how does the nature module grow from YHouse? This is a kind of a practitioner's interdisciplinary perspective on the science that I sort of came from, but didn't really belong to exactly. Physics, chemistry, and biology all inherited antiquated languages because every human practice does. You're never good at doing what you will now do. You're always good at doing what you did before, which was something else. You can't escape that. But we praise those languages where the phenomena of nature coming from behind us always, where we can't see it, eventually forces us to invent a new language that's faithful to its structure and allows us to tear ourselves away from the antiquated languages. What I wonder when I look at what physicists are doing today, how much are they choosing what they look at in the world according to its ability to fit into the things that they know how to solve? It seems like an awful lot of it to me, and it seems like a lost opportunity. My hope is, it's been this way in Origin of Life, but it extends even more so if we think about the origin of cognition or consciousness or awareness, that there is a new phenomenology that will refuse to be understood in the things that we were already good at solving because it contains surprises that were not uncovered in the phenomena we understood before. How can we be receptive and seek that out instead of resisting it? And in particular, this is where, knowing nothing, I'm optimistic for the collaboration with people from the contemplative traditions, to the extent that they have a system for reasoning about states of mind that draws from a different source from the objectifying language. Where can we find new fabrics of languages that were not envisioned? So for instance, suppose I grew up knowing algebra and the character of thinking that comes from syntax as I inherit it from natural language. And someone said, hey, there's this great math called geometry. And suppose I don't have vision. He says, geometry grows out of this sense called vision, and it leads you to see relations among things in the world. And as an algebraist, I say, I don't get it, I don't get it. But then something happens and I begin to see that geometry is not just algebra. Geometry is its own thing. Are there new fabrics that we can find where we've not seen them because there are not overlapping languages? What I can see as an outsider of the nature of awareness debates makes me optimistic that maybe this is something that's missing. And so with trust in each other, maybe there are things we can find. I think that's all there is. So, am I in time?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.